I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Voit Janowski. Voit sees patients with thrombotic and other general hematological problems, as well as those with leukemias, lymphomas, myeloma, myeloproliferative neoplasms, and myelodysplasia. His main interests are the diagnosis and treatment of hematological malignancies, and he is the clinical lead for trials in multiple myeloma and CLL at the Calvary Mater. He works on protocol development and the rapid translation of cancer research into clinical setting. He's involved in every level of medical training, from medical students to hematology advanced trainees, coordinates a hematology training program for general physician trainees, and has spoken at various GP events. After completing his physician and hematology training in Melbourne, Voit joined the hematology team at the Calvary Mater in 2014. He started in private practice in 2015 and has relocated to the Hunter Cancer Centre at Gateshead to be able to provide a more comprehensive consultation and cancer treatment service. Voit's presentation is called Managing Expectation of Emerging Therapies. Thanks, Voit.
Thanks very much, Danielle, and what a talk to follow, Peter. Thank you very much for that. Even I learned something from that, so that was great. Thank you. Look, as Danielle said, I'm a hematologist, both in public and private practice in a lovely city called Newcastle. If you don't know it, it is neither new nor has any castles in it. But it is a great place to live, and you'll never shift me from that at all. As time has gone on, and while I certainly used to treat all of those things and continue to do, most of my work at the moment is now on treating people with myeloma, and particularly on trying to attract more clinical trials to regional centres, particularly our own. And we've been very fortunate to have excellent industry partners, as well as support from our colleagues around Australia. And we're the first centre outside of a capital city to administer CAR T cells, which was in the context of a clinical trial about 8 weeks ago. So a huge amount of effort by our staff. So that was a great achievement. And so I'm very excited about what this new era of medications brings to patients with myeloma. I think Peter's just talked about some extremely exciting therapies, and I 100% agree with him that they are all very, very exciting. And we really appreciate being able to give them to patients in the context of our clinical trials. So when Myeloma Australia asked me to give this talk, I can't say I was overly enthusiastic, because I really feel like I was asked to rain a little bit on the parade. But it's not really that. I came around to the idea and realized that it's all very well reading and hearing about all of these extremely exciting therapies, but if you can't get access to them in a timely fashion, then is it just, is it false hope, or what can you do? And so I think when we're reading about all of these things which are available in clinical trials and are available overseas, we also have to be realistic about when we are going to be able to get them into routine clinical practice in Australia. We work extremely hard to get them here on clinical trials, but only a tiny minority of our patients will actually benefit from clinical trials themselves, because they are, by their very nature, small and often not applicable to many people, as we'll cover later on. In the end, when thinking about these things, I'm always focused on the fact that our goal is ultimately cure of myeloma and what that means. And I am extremely excited by the progress that has been made even in the last 15 years in the treatment of myeloma. And Peter showed that lovely slide of how with every generation of myeloma medications, people with myeloma live longer, and that's fantastic. But ultimately, we have to remember that, I don't have to tell this audience, that ultimately what we want when it comes to a cure is a treatment you can have for a limited duration of time. That basically means you are done with this disease, that life is back to normal, that it hasn't caused you lots of problems as transplants can do and other treatments can do, and your life expectancy is now what it would have been without myeloma. And so when you look at where we've come from, you can be really, really happy. And when you look at where we still need to get, you can tell that there's still a great deal of work to do. And clinical research trials and getting these medications early is part of that process. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, what a long road it is from conducting a clinical trial to actually being able to prescribe a medication on the PBS, and for someone with myeloma to get it for, $35 or $39 a dose or prescription, and how complicated that process really is. I'm going to talk a little bit on why often what we may expect from a medication doesn't actually match up in what we consider to be the real world, which is PBS prescribing. And then, since I will be talking and encouraging the participation in clinical trials, talk about the maze of accessing those and what that means to you as a patient in a clinical trial, what you might need to know in general terms. So if we think a little bit about how a medication gets from a good idea or from a laboratory to the PBS, there are very many steps on this road. And in fact, before we even get to that phase 1 first in human study, there's a lot of research being done predominantly at universities and small biotech companies where they're taking good ideas or things they know about the basic biology of myeloma, and testing it out on cell lines and testing it out on rats and trying to find new medications and new chemicals that may actually be helpful. That phase can take a very, very long time. The first concept that something like a CAR T cell, may be able to work was in sort of 1987. That was when people first conceptualized that a CAR T cell may work. The first time one was actually given to a human being was 15, 16 years later. The first registration of any CAR T cell for any disease took another decade from there. So it's a very, very long process. But basically what happens when it comes to actually people receiving these medications is that the company, first of all, has to do studies which are considered higher risk on very small numbers of people. And these are the first human beings to ever receive these medications. Someone's got to be number one, right? And while you try and predict as best as you can what the side effects might be, and as best as you can what the correct dose might be, in the end, somebody has to be first. And so this is a small number of people, very carefully controlled studies, generally done in very large centers. We need a lot of support and backup to be able to do the tests properly. So very hard to find these outside of capital cities, although we do nudge into these a little bit in some centers. And really, these are studies for people who really have no better option left to treat their myeloma. So all your good options have been exhausted, and you're now trying to find something that may well be of help. And a lot of medications actually fall over at this stage. We know that a lot of medications won't work, and most of us will never hear about them in the first place. But say it does, say it looks promising, it doesn't cause any terrible side effects. Well, the company's then is going to do some larger studies. And so instead of 10 or 20 patients in the phase 1 studies, we'll probably take this up to about 50 patients. And here they're trying to better define what they know about the medication. So these studies, we've got some idea about how to dose the medication, but we're really trying to optimize the doses, trying to find the absolute best dose you can use, as well as trying to combine it with other myeloma treatments and seeing whether you have any sign that there's actually a synergy, that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, and making sure that there isn't any surprising side effect when you add them together. And so that's really important. And so at this point in time, another 50-odd people have received the medication. If it looks really promising at that point in time, in other words, it looks safe, it looks well tolerated, and there's an indication that the medication is going to be effective as well, what the company then needs to do is they need to prove that it actually works compared to what we have already. And those are the phase 3 studies. So generally speaking, this is the first time that you'll see a clinical study where there's any randomization involved. And so these are studies where a person will agree to participate in the study, not knowing whether they will be receiving the standard treatment or whether they will be receiving the newer experimental treatment. And these are really important because not every treatment out there is actually going to prove to be a good idea. Some medications are going to have side effects that are going to make them less attractive than what we have already. And there's no point having a treatment that is extremely potent and able to kill myeloma cells if it makes people's lives miserable and the side effects stop them from being able to take it. And there's also no point having an extremely modern, expensive medication that doesn't work any better than what we already have. And so this is where those phase 3 studies are crucially important. Because in Australia, as you'll see in a little bit, we tend to be a little bit behind in registering new medications. And because these studies take a really long time to run, even with the control arm, even the one that's the standard treatment, in some of these international studies is actually better than what we can give patients in Australia at the moment. So somebody asked the question about daratumumab in the front line. And if you look at some of the phase 3 studies we have at the moment that are looking at medications like teclistamab and similar medications being added to the front line, the comparison there is against daratumumab, lenalidomide, and dexamethasone. So that's a scenario in which you might not get the newest stuff, but you'll still get something better than PBS. So those are really attractive studies to consider. Anyway, once all of that research has been done is where you actually get to the point of talking to the regulatory authorities. And this is very different around the world. So in the United States and often in Europe, companies can actually approach the FDA at the conclusion of their phase 2 studies. Because the FDA, which is the American equivalent of our TGA, is only interested in, is this medication safe and does it do what it says on the tin? Does it actually treat the disease in question? And if it does, the company then gets approval to market the medication, to sell it in the United States. So that's always the first goal for the pharmaceutical company. That is the market in the world that pays the most for medications of anywhere else on the planet. And that's where they stand to make most of their money. So that's what they focus on. Our TGA is similar to the FDA in that they will accept an early application on the basis of those phase 2 studies. And what that allows the company to do is to sell the medication to patients in Australia and to talk to doctors about it in Australia. But it doesn't have anything to do with government funding. It doesn't have anything to do with the PBS saying, yes, we will pay for this medication. And so really up until this point in time, our regulatory process in Australia is very similar to what you would see overseas. The challenge then is the PBS. And the PBS in Australia is charged with managing the pharmaceutical budget. And this is a very difficult job because myeloma is one of many diseases. And so what they are doing is they are looking at all of the clinical trial data that the company has submitted to them, and they're trying to quantify the benefit to the individual patient. They try to put an effect number in terms of how many patients do we need to treat in order for one of them to have, say, a year of extra life. And then they look at that benefit and they look at what the company has asked the PBS to pay for that medication. And they say, well, what that means is in order to pay for this treatment, if we pay for this treatment, we will have to spend, say, $50,000 for an extra year of survival on average per patient. And they don't have a firm number. They don't have an absolute line in the sand that they require that treatment to meet, because it does depend a little bit on the disease group. It depends a little bit on how many other treatment options are available for that disease. And it does depend on how good the treatment is. But they do ultimately have to come to a decision. And the reality is it's a bit like buying any high cost asset, be it a house or a car or anything else. The first price discussed is rarely what actually gets approved. And it is extremely unusual for the PBS to approve anything on the first attempt, especially with high cost cancer medications. There are a number of reasons for this, and not all of them are the government's fault. When the pharmaceutical companies put the application into the PBS, they're also very mindful of what they're selling the medication for around the world. And as I mentioned, the United States, which is always first past the post when it comes to medications, pays more for their medications than anybody else on the planet, and they set the global price for the medication. And everything else after that to reduce the price is a negotiation. And so this process can take several years. We are a small market, we're 26 million people compared to, say, the United States of 360 million people. Getting the medications on our market is a priority for the pharmaceutical companies, but it's not priority number one for them. And so we have to be mindful that we are operating in this sort of environment. This whole process can actually take several years to run its course, and it can be extremely frustrating to watch because as clinicians, we want to use these medications as soon as we see the clinical trial data published. As patients, you want to have access to these medications as soon as the clinical trial data is published. But it might be a 3 or 4 or a longer wait even before we can use the medication. And then, for example, like daratumumab, we may be severely restricted in how we use it. And so this can take an extremely long time. Now, pharmaceutical companies can choose to make the medication available early in Australia. They can do that in whatever method they want. So once they have TGA approval, they can then go out into the community and say, we have this new medication for myeloma. It's going to cost you this much. If you want to buy it, you can buy it and you can have it. But this is how much it costs you. Some of them can choose to do things like offset the cost of that medication. So, for example, they might say you can buy 4 doses of this medication and we'll give you 4 doses. So that offsets the price. In other words, it reduces the price of the medication to you, but it means they don't have to reduce the sticker price. And very occasionally, although it seems to be becoming less common, at least for a period of time, they will make the medication available completely free of charge on what's called a compassionate basis. And you can discuss the morality of it, but there is no rule and there is no law that says they have to do that. So when they do that, that's of their own accord. I don't really want to get into that too much because it's a complicated discussion. So that's what the process that has to work for things like teclistamab, etc., for all of those other molecules, but it's slightly different than what happens with CAR T cells. Because, as Peter pointed out, CAR T cells are a product that's manufactured from living cells. They're not actually considered a medication in Australia. They're considered a cell therapy and are regulated as if they were a medical procedure. And so they are regulated by the same authority that looks at, for example, will Medicare pay for this new blood test? Or will Medicare pay for this new surgical procedure? It's the same process to look at CAR T cells. And so the PBAC don't actually have a role to play when it comes to approving the funding for CAR T cells. But the basic principles they follow are the same. Although as an outsider looking in, and I've not had anything to do with the negotiations with MSAC, but as an outsider looking in, it does look like they at least have a little bit more flexibility and room to move because their criteria are not quite as rigid as those of the PBS. On the other hand, it's also a more complicated mechanism because the way CAR T cell treatments are funded in Australia, the federal government has to share the costs of the CAR T cells and the treatment with the state governments. With PBS, the federal government picks up the entire cost. So as you can imagine, that's a more complicated discussion because as we know, state-federal discussions about money are always a little bit more complicated. And so, this is all extremely frustrating. It's frustrating for us as doctors standing in front of these medicine cabinets knowing we can't actually use these treatments yet. And it's frustrating for you as well. We all live in a global community now. And I think it's fair enough that you can ask why treatments that are proven in clinical trials that are in use in other countries are not available in Australia. And I would encourage you to advocate as a community, and I think that Myeloma Australia has been phenomenal in driving this, and particularly with the CAR T cells. And the application to MSAC. And I think the myeloma community has been phenomenal in writing to the PBS and writing to MSAC and telling them what it means to them to have these treatments on the PBS and on Medicare. I think that's crucially important. I think I'd write to your MP. I would write to everyone you know of any influence and talk about this as much as you can, because I think it's a big problem. The government recognizes it's a problem, and they are working through a process at the moment where they're reviewing how they fund medications. But all of these reviews take a long time, and it's still a work in progress. The argument from their side is, look, they do have a limited budget, and I'll throw some of the numbers around a little bit later just for interest. They do have a limited budget, and they have a lot of competing health priorities, and not all of the information or not all the clinical trials that pharmaceutical companies produce is absolutely correct. And there are many ways in which you can adjust the design and interpretation of a clinical study to make a medication look a lot better than it may actually be. And so we can't have a system where we rely on the pharmaceutical industry to self-regulate the quality of the information they produce. I think the pharmaceutical industry is extremely important. We wouldn't have the medications we have without them, considering the cost of developing medications. But there needs to be a balanced system. I would argue right now we don't have that balance correct, and I would argue that for a country as rich as Australia, we should have earlier access to these medications, and it's extremely frustrating for everyone involved. So I'm going to switch tack a little bit, and as I mentioned before, sometimes our expectations of these medications may not match the reality. And what I mean by this is that either the treatment is not quite as good as we thought it was, and we get told that this medication is great, this monoclonal antibody or this bispecific antibody has this amazing effect and this great response rate. And then we actually give it on the PBS, and we give it to people on the PBS, and we look back and say, you know what, it's not actually as good as those initial studies suggested. And this is a really important thing to understand, particularly if you're considering buying your own medications. I think you've got to have a very clear idea of, if you're going to be spending tens of thousands of dollars of your own money on medications, you've got to have a very good idea of what that treatment may actually offer you, not just in terms of benefit, but also in terms of side effects. And so, I always, you'll find this placement of the real world in quotation marks in a lot of scientific literature. And I find it very amusing that we are talking about the real world in quotes as if it's some sort of strange entity. But it also, what it reflects is that really the world of clinical studies is a little bit artificial, because patients in clinical studies compared to the patients that come through our clinics on average are younger. They have fewer health problems in general. They often have slower moving myeloma, as you'll see when we talk about what it takes to participate in a clinical study. The time from saying, yes, I'm interested in the study to actually receiving treatment on it can be 3 or 4 weeks. And so if the myeloma is moving extremely aggressively, you may not actually get that treatment. So people with the worst sort of myeloma, that very aggressive disease that's just day by day growing further and further, aren't well represented on clinical studies because they just don't have time to enroll onto them. Because clinical studies are generally done in larger hospitals and more affluent countries, you're looking at a different population in general, and people with better access to health resources. If you look at, the sort of people that get onto clinical studies at these at these ultra premium cancer centers in the United States, they're not the same as the people who come from regional Australia. They don't have the same access to resources. And also on a clinical study, the patients are followed extremely closely. And if you've ever participated in a clinical study, you know what all of the extra requirements of being on a study, and you know how closely the trial team watches you compared to routine clinical practice. And that's probably a reason why people will be able to maintain the treatment for longer on a study than offered. And so when you're looking at a new medication and thinking, should I give it to the patient in front of me? These are the sorts of questions I'm asking about that patient, or these are the sorts of questions you could ask yourself about any new treatment, be it on the PBS or otherwise, is did the people in the study used to register this medication, did they actually look like me? Were they similar people to me? Were they of a similar age? Because there's no point if you're 75 or 78 or 85 looking at treatments that were the best thing ever in 40-year-olds who could deal with a lot more side effects. We know that from every aspect of medicine. Were they as sick as I am, or were they sicker? What treatments for myeloma did they have? And does that influence whether this treatment will work for it? And after considering all of that, are the expectations I have about this treatment and what it can do for me realistic? Is this treatment and all of its side effects that I am likely, because there's no such thing as a treatment without side effects, are all of these treatments, is it worth participating in? Is it worth taking this medication? Is it worth paying for this medication? And it's not just about the medication itself sometimes. If you look at the BCMA targeting bispecific antibodies, and there's a few of these around, teclistamab is registered by the TGA in Australia but not funded. There are a few other ones in clinical studies. And if you look at all of those medications, what you can guarantee is that people are going to end up on replacement immunoglobulin, Intragam. And people who have been on Intragam to boost their immune system know that that's either something you have to inject yourself under the skin every week, or it's something you're receiving in a hospital every 4 weeks. And that's an ongoing thing from what we can see. And that's not often talked about as a side effect. But from your perspective as a patient, it means you have to be somewhere every 4 weeks because you need those top-ups of antibodies. These are all things that need to go into consideration when looking at some of these new treatments. So think about questions like, how often do I need to take the treatment and where can I have it? Do I have to come to this hospital to have it? Could I have it at home? Could I give it myself? And some of these things are possible, for example, having treatment at home, but the availability of it is very lumpy around Australia and very, very patchy. How long does the treatment go for? Most myeloma treatments these days are actually indefinite. In other words, you start on the treatment and you carry it on until it stops working, or until the side effects cause you to stop, or until you finally decide, I've actually had enough. We know carfilzomib is on the PBS. Carfilzomib is a very potent medication and very, very useful. But the original treatment schedule with carfilzomib was twice a week, intravenously, 3 weeks out of 4. That's a huge commitment. And all of these other questions. So, ask your hematologist, sure, this is my 5th treatment for myeloma. What are the realistic chances this is actually going to work for me? And if it does work, how long will it work for? And I think that's a really important question that you go into these, any treatments and any trials, understanding that information for yourself. The other reason why, reality and expectations may not meet is because of this problem of accessing the treatments anyway. We've been talking about CAR T cells in these patient seminars for at least a couple of years now. And so where are we up to in Australia? This is the latest update based on everything that's available publicly. So CAR T cell, cilta-cel, is the only registered CAR T cell in Australia for myeloma, cilta-captogene autoleucel or cilta-cel. The TGA approved it sometime last year. And so that means theoretically, you could buy them. I'll show you why that may not be such a great idea in a minute. But even practically speaking, at the moment, that's not possible. And the discussions that the company is currently having with federal and state governments and MSAC is as a treatment beyond 4 lines of therapy. To show you how long these applications and negotiations take, the first application, which probably took about 6 months to put together, ago, at which point they basically said, the data is immature. We don't know whether this is really as good as you say it is. And oh, by the way, it is far too expensive. The company immediately started working on the next submission. And the next submission was considered by MSAC November last year. And so that is a very long time between, sitting down, between, meetings at the table to actually sit down and talk about what's going on and will you pay for it. And a huge amount of progress was made at the second application from what I can see. And I'll show you some quotations in a second. But still, the government essentially came back and said, it's still too expensive. So if you look at the publicly available minutes, I know most people have more of a life than I do, so I will quickly highlight the bits that may be interesting, is that on the government side, they acknowledge that people who are at this late line of myeloma treatment don't have a lot of options, and that cilta-cel, that CAR T cells absolutely work, and they work better compared to the previous. However, they still, if you read further down, it's too expensive. And on the basis of both the MSAC committee and the submissions from the states and territories, they basically said, we can't go there, we can't fund this until CAR T cells are significantly cheaper than what they are today. And in the minutes from all of these things, the company always gets a right of response, which gets published along with the minutes. And I am not implying anything about either side in this debate. I just want to show you where the discussions are up to at the moment. And basically, Janssen, who's the manufacturer that sells CAR T cells, said, look, basically, we've tried really, really hard to sharpen our pencils and get the cost down. We've reduced it by 40% over the 5 years compared to what we asked before. So if it's too expensive at a 40% discount, imagine what the original price is like. But they're officially saying, look, basically, until you guys recognize that this is a really, really good treatment and therefore it's expensive, we're kind of stuck. That doesn't fill me with confidence. But as you can imagine, there is a huge amount of motivation to get these things funded, to get people treated. And a deferral, which is what I pointed out happened at the last meeting, is a little bit different than a rejection. A deferral says, basically, from what I can see, we're almost there, but there's a little bit more work to be done. And hopefully what that means is they can sit down at the table sooner than another 18 months and have further discussions. So fingers firmly crossed. Why is the government being like this? Why is the government being so recalcitrant in funding these amazing treatments? And this is what scares them. So I am using publicly available numbers here, and I'm taking this from a paper published in the US. So while I think the cost of CAR T cells is probably about right if you were buying them yourself, the cost of care in Australia is probably smaller than that, $250,000 to, and that is delivering the CAR T cells. It's all the apheresis, it's all of the treatment, it's everything else. And so if you look at all of that, if you basically, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically they're just scared of a cost of $1 million a patient. And if only 10% of people diagnosed with myeloma ever in Australia were diagnosed with it, you're already talking about $250 million a year. And that is, as you can imagine, extremely frightening if you're the PBS, particularly when you consider that the entire PBS budget's about $15 billion. And myeloma is less than 2% of all cancers that they have to fund treatments for. So I don't blame them for having difficulty with the cost. I just really hope we can find a way to get over it. The other question is about the bispecifics and where are we at? And the reality is that while we are using a lot of teclistamab in research studies, there is no phase 3 data yet, and the PBS needs phase 3 data before they will consider the application because they need something to compare it to. So it's not here soon. The current cost, if you choose to purchase it, is approximately $7,000 a dose, and the official prescribing schedule is once a week. I wouldn't ever use it once a week. Most of the studies now don't use it once a week, but that's the official cost and the official line at the moment. And the company says, look, we know it's expensive. We'll at least give you 4 for every 4 that you buy. So at least it kind of halves the price of it. And if you're the right patient, if you fit the sort of the trial criteria, in other words, you're a similar patient to the patients treated on the studies, the chances of it working are about 2 and 3. And so you're spending about $28,000 before you know whether it's working. And then if it is working, you've got to think about how you're going to fund it after that. Pretty frightening stuff. And so it comes to the fact that for a lot of these newer medications, and particularly the stuff coming down the track even now, the only practical way to access these treatments, if your Powerball ticket didn't come up this week, is to participate in a clinical study. And that's something you need to always be thinking about and considering. First of all, you've got to find a clinical study. And just because, you have to recognize that studies that, that research studies come and go at every hospital. They open and shut depending on what's on the study and what's happening with it around the world. And they're targeted at different patient groups. While imperfect, probably the most useful tool as a general statement, if you want to go looking around, is this website called ClinTrialRefer. It can take a little bit of work to find your way around where the myeloma studies are, but you have to go into hematology first, and then multiple myeloma, and then Australia, and then your state, and then your hospital. And that is a reasonably accurate guide to what most hospitals have available, although it's not 100% accurate. And the other thing is always be asking your clinician when it's time to choose a new treatment. Say, are there any studies nearby? Do you have any studies here? Or are there any studies in a hospital that I could travel to that may be of benefit to me? And I think that's always really important to ask. It's not as straightforward as having the study available to you, as there's a number of different steps that you'd have to go through in between enrolling on a study, or sort of agreeing to be on a study and actually getting treatment on it. And so generally speaking, what we will do at our hospital is before we even suggest a clinical study to someone, before we even know whether they might be interested, we first of all have a look at the criteria that the study has, and these are called inclusion and exclusion criteria, to see whether the person would qualify for that study. Because I don't want to be telling you about a clinical study that may be available to you if you're never going to qualify for it anyway. What's the point of that discussion? What's the point of raising hopes that there might be something available if it isn't? And so a lot of the time we will look at people and say, no, I'm not going to raise that one because we know their kidneys don't work well enough to qualify, for example. But say the study does look like it'll work for you. You do look like a good candidate or a potentially good candidate for that study, or you may be interested in it. And I, as a clinician, believe that it's worth your while considering. You will get told about the study and you will receive a often 20 to 40 page consent form. This consent form, which is much more complicated than it needs to be a lot of the time, outlines everything that participating in the study will involve. It also outlines all of the potential downsides and all of the potential risks of being involved in the study. And that includes all of the medications. So it'll list all the horrible effects of dexamethasone and all the horrible effects of lenalidomide and bortezomib and all of the other things that can happen. And so sometimes it's almost too confronting to read all the potential side effects, when sometimes the reality is the other option is having a lot of those medications on the PBS anyway. But say you read all of that and you ask all the questions you want to ask and you say, yep, I'm going to do it. I want to be in the study. That's the point at which you sign the consent form and go into a phase of the process called screening. Screening is a process where you have a lot of tests to make sure that everything about you and the myeloma that you have fits for the clinical study, so that you are the kind of person that they are looking for the study. In other words, you've had a certain number of treatments and the myeloma has done this, and you've had these treatments in the past. And also making sure that you don't have any health conditions that make it more dangerous for you to be on the study. And so if a medication can cause neuropathy and you already have a lot of neuropathy, then they won't let you onto that study. If you meet all of those criteria, and it is a randomization step. That's sort of when you get enrolled onto the study properly. If there's a randomization to different treatments, that's when that happens. And then finally, you can get onto treatment. And as I mentioned, that can take up to 4 weeks to get that process from consent to treatment finished. I'm pretty confident that's actually my final slide. A couple more. There are potential downsides of being on clinical studies. I think the reality is why we always think that the newer, shinier thing is better. That's not always the case. And sometimes there are unforeseen side effects that people have to be mindful of. The reality is that on a clinical study, the treatment schedule of when you get each medication is much more rigid than it is on routine PBS treatment. So, for example, I've got lots of patients on carfilzomib. If they're on carfilzomib on PBS and everything's going really well, and they say, I'm going overseas for a month, I say, great, away you go. If you're on a clinical study and you're getting treatment and you say, I want to go sailing around the world for 3 months, we have a problem. Because while there is always room to move and negotiation, and it's not that you can't interrupt the treatment, there are limits put in place to what you can do. So, in the first 3 months of a study, you might find it very hard to change the scheduling, whereas maybe, a year down the track, it's a lot easier. And of course, it's very different depending on what's going on and what the study looks like. You will inevitably be having more blood tests. You will often have more scans and generally more tests. There are diaries to fill in. There are quality of life assessments to fill in. And unfortunately, there are more bone marrow biopsies as well. For a lot of myeloma studies. And it's often because you're doing very well and you've achieved a complete remission. And that's when we ask you to, or complete response. And that's when we ask you for another bone marrow sample in order to confirm that there's no myeloma left in that bone marrow and do tests like MRD and things like that. And so it is a bigger commitment. In fact, one of the hematologists at Peter Mac said, quite happily says that being on a study can be like a full-time job. I think that's not quite as bad as that. And I have plenty of people who have full-time jobs who participate in studies, but it is a time commitment. And so you need to have that motivation to do that. But the personal upsides for you being on a clinical study is, of course, having access to treatments you might not otherwise have access to. And I always laugh at being on a study sometimes is you have this concierge service from the trial coordinators where you've always got a point of contact. You've always got someone interested in every side effect that may be happening. And you're generally watched by a whole team of people, even if that is remotely. There's a lot of people looking very carefully to make sure that you're getting the treatments as you're meant to be getting them and that the side effects are being noted and managed. And in a way, participating in a clinical trial is how you make that, those expectations perhaps come a little bit closer to reality. Because, if you say, well, how do patients do on clinical trials? Well, that could be you as well. You're on a clinical trial. So that's, I think, everywhere I had to get. And I'm grateful that Peter finished his talk a bit early so I could ramble on a bit longer. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Voit. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure that our community got a lot out of that. So thank you so much. We've probably got time just for one question. So I will email the other questions to Voit and our team, and we'll respond to those that we don't get to. But one question we had was, how can somebody who lives in a rural or remote location access clinical trials? They are mainly in metropolitan centres. Is there an option to access them from their local treating centre, but be part of a bigger trial from a metropolitan location?
Yeah, I would love for this to be simpler. The reality is a lot of the time our regional patients are traveling for those studies. And so some studies that's practical and some it's not. Often on the studies being run by pharmaceutical companies, the company will reimburse you generously or appropriately for your travel and accommodation for participation in the study. So at least the cost aspect, but the time aspect, of course, you can't overcome. There is a lot of talk about teletrials and how do you bring these studies out to smaller centers. A lot of work is being done, and I can tell you my colleagues in regional centres in northern New South Wales are working extremely hard to make this a reality. And the ALLG, the Australasian Leukemia Lymphoma Group, is working very hard to make these a reality. But it is complicated, not just from a regulatory point of view. And it's simple things like if you're getting an infused experimental medicine, who makes that medication up in a regional center in a small town? How do you get it there when it's stable? How do you administer it and monitor for side effects appropriately and things like that? So a lot of work is being done on this, but it's a very hard problem to solve. I agree. And so unfortunately, the best way is to participate in more studies, any studies that your local regional center has, try and get onto them, prove that there are the patients in that region that need clinical studies, and that will help the doctors there in the clinical trial units there get more studies in the future. And it's about, building slowly, building capacity slowly, unfortunately, at the moment.
Thanks, Voigt. Thank you for your time today in presenting to us. I'm sure that the community got a lot out of it, as I mentioned earlier. I know that I sure did. So thank you very much for volunteering and coming to present in week 1 of National Myeloma Month.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks very much.